Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experience and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self-awareness. I am Artemis. On this episode, we are going to be talking about the litany of fallacies that I've been finding out there, all surrounding the topic of transphobia. And not only are we going to be covering some of these fallacies, but I'm also going to be hopefully giving you a way to kind of cut through the BS and generate some room for problem solving and for some clarity on the topic. So in order to do that, as is customary on this channel, I usually start with defining the words that we're going to be using so that we can have a clear understanding of where I'm coming from and give background for the logic that I present. It gets a little nitpicky, so I apologize up front, but it's important that we establish these things. So already, though, going to dictionary.com, which is supposed to be an unbiased source for the definition of words, I found that not to be the case. So bear with me here. We're going to get through these few definitions, a little bit of word history. We'll break it down to phobia, the word phobia, which is, by definition, an aversion or irrational fear of something. And the Latin root for trans just means across, beyond, or through. So a transgender person would be somebody whose gender is across or beyond whatever they presented at birth, let's just say. So in reality, if we're going to be talking about the fear or aversion to transgenders, it should be called transgender phobia. But that aside, we're just going to say that we recognize that transphobia, or at least the dictionary definition should be for transphobia, the fear or aversion of transgender people. However, when I went and looked up the definition of transphobia, what I found, and I quote, it's an aversion or hostility to or disdain for transgender people. So, as it seems customary for this day and age, they've loaded a ton more emotional meaning to the word than is actually there or should be there just based on the raw definition. For no reason that I can distinguish other than that transgender people here are being seen as a class of victims, which is no bueno. You might find as you listen to some of my videos that I don't subscribe to the whole victimhood mentality. So the fact that dictionary.com is doing this already, I don't think that's a good sign. So moving beyond the definition of the word. For starters, it seems to me that people get labeled phobic of something if their opinion is different than the person who is calling them phobic, which is an incredibly immature, childish, and cheap tactic to invalidate somebody else's opinion. To actually be transphobic would be to make a statement like, all transgender people are evil, because that would be an irrational statement, likely based in fear, and have no objective truth. Now, I have yet to be labeled an outright transphobe, so I'm going to head this off at the pass. And honestly, what better person to expose the lack of logic in those kinds of claims than a transgender person who is advocating for the supposed transphobic statement? And I've seen other people who are not transgenders make very similar claims that I have made or will make on this channel, and yet they get labeled transphobic. So, for example, the statements that I've made saying that trans women should not be allowed to compete in biological women's sports. And I don't think that it's fair that the person who makes that same statement who isn't transgender is being labeled transphobic, but that somebody like myself wouldn't be. To me, that exposes a lack of logic, a lack of continuity. So I then ask this question. If any of my views actually are transphobic, or that I am somehow transphobic, answer me this. Why would I bother then to come out and embrace being transgender, especially so late in my life, if I absolutely hated transgender people? Being transgender isn't a choice, you're born that way, but I could have stayed in my other life, living a lie, very unhappy, simply because I hated transgenders. If I was transphobic, I would have potentially chosen to live that way instead of the authentic person that I am now. And the views that I express that might be considered transphobic bring me peace and stability and understanding in the world, and they don't oppress anybody else. And no, I do not subscribe to the whole belief that words are violence, because they literally aren't. So usually, if there is somebody who belongs to a certain group of people that they are supposedly being phobic about, or they're making hateful statements about, they themselves are perhaps repressing the fact that they belong to that group. So, for example, you could have somebody who is a closeted gay and they're hating on other gays. And they're doing it because they're bitter and angry and resentful that they are not living their most authentic life, and they are hating on the thing that they wish that they could have. And of course, that applies in a lot of areas of life, but you could be making homophobic statements when you yourself are gay if you are not free to be yourself, or you don't feel free to be yourself. The alternative explanation for, let's just say, me being transphobic is that I'm experiencing some pretty serious cognitive dissonance, which I don't think it takes a genius to spot somebody who is displaying that kind of instability, honestly. Instead, the most simple explanation for anybody calling me a transphobe for my views would be that they're just wrong. The only thing that they have to say to invalidate my points in opposition to them is to label them as hate speech, which is narcissistic, gaslighting behavior that's masquerading as virtue, and it's twisted. If anything, sometimes well-meaning people can say things that are limiting beliefs, and they just need a nudge in the right direction with some education to better understand things, which is what this entire channel aims to do. But that doesn't make it a phobia or hate speech. And on that note, I watched a video recently that just popped up from Jamie, not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Jammy Dodger's channel. And he was talking about how actual transphobic people make statements that are actually pro-trans, but we're not going to talk about that. There was a specific example in there where somebody who was transphobic approached a transgender individual and very angrily, very bitterly said, "You will never be a woman," or "You will never be a man," basically saying that they're never going to be the sex that they're transitioning, that they're gender transitioning towards. Now, it's true, the statement that, let's just say me, a transmasculine person, if somebody were to come up to me and say, "You will never be a man," that's actually a true statement. I never will be, no matter how many surgeries I get and how much hormone I take. And it's important not to label those people transphobic simply based on what they've said, because what they've said is true. Now, it's also probably true that they are transphobic, because the way that they said that was pretty nasty and, angry. So yeah, likely they said it because they have a serious problem with transgender people. But I think it's incredibly important to keep those things separate and not just label people transphobic because they disagree with you, and certainly not to label them transphobic when what they're saying is actually factually true. So let's go back to that example. What would you do in that situation if somebody did come up to you and say, "You will never be male or female," whatever you're trying to present to the world as? You stop and you say, "You know what? You're right." And I promise you, you will stun them to silence. They won't have anything else to say, or at least not immediately, because they're expecting you to argue with them. They're coming at you with all the fear and anger that they can possibly muster. You, they think, are the reason why that something they hold dear is going to disappear, that they don't have control over it. And I'm not saying that what they're doing is right or justified, because it isn't. Also, what I aim to do on this channel is to foster some empathy and understanding on both sides of any issue, because if you come at somebody wanting to argue, wanting to fight, you will get nowhere, especially if they're already in that mode. And I'm also not saying that there aren't evil people out there, because there are. There are just plain evil asshole people that you're not going to be able to do anything about other than just walk away, get away from them. But there are also people out there who say things that they do because they're afraid. And if you can recognize the difference between that evil asshole and somebody who's saying something because they're afraid, and you can open up the door and say, actually, you know what, you're right, I won't be, and will never be, can never be a male or a female, but I'm not here to destroy anything that you hold dear. Whatever you're afraid of, I'm not here to do that. My gender, my biology really doesn't have much to do with the contribution that I plan to make to this world. In fact, I'm trying to make things better. And I'd venture to guess that you may be too. You just have a different idea of how to do that. And again, if you actually can get that out, if you can manage to create that kind of a conversation, that one person who was once so against you can become your greatest ally, your biggest voice for cooperation and peace. And ultimately, those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to do with this channel. I'm trying to not only recognize factual things and keep those in the forefront of the discussion so that we don't lose sight of them, because what we're seeing in culture today is a lot of things happening because people feel a certain way and they fail to recognize objective reality. They can't separate the two. So I aim to do that, as well as open the door for empathy and curiosity and dialogue with people, because that is ultimately the only way that you're going to make headway with anyone, at least lasting positive headway, instead of fighting people over it. So anyway, let's end this on a happy note here. And I'll say that for anybody out there, transgender or not, who is coming up against people like that, who are labeling them phobic and it's just driving you crazy, you're not alone. I understand. Keep seeking truth and stay strong. And if you're a transgender person and you encounter one of these people that is reacting to you out of fear, take the more emotionally evolved road by being objective and showing some empathy. You'll be secure enough in yourself not to need validation from them if you fail to make a breakthrough. So on that note, always, I welcome questions and comments and storytelling below. And if you think this video might help somebody, anybody, I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe it so that other people can see it and we can help accomplish the goal of making the world a better place. And until next time.